Hello, welcome to The Debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world.
Oh, wow. Wow, wow, wow. So beautiful.
Thank you, New Hampshire. And now it's on to Nevada, South Carolina, and beyond.
Oh, really? When are the primaries going to stop surprising us? Plus, the new war-weary refugees, 100,000 facing a cold, wintry wait. Fancy predicting the results of Super Tuesday on March 1st? After this week's surprise, but no surprise, in New Hampshire, it really could be anyone's race. Is Trump really on the road to the White House? Is 74-year-old Bernie really going to lead the Democrats?
New Hampshire, I want to thank you. We love you. We're going to be back a lot. We're not going to forget you. You started it. Remember, you started it.
The government of our great country belongs to all of the people and not just a handful of wealthy campaign contributors.
Here's what we're going to do. Now we take this campaign to the entire country. We're going to fight for every vote in every state. I want to say I still love New Hampshire, and I always will.
Well, as usual, Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson is standing by for us in New York, and Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams is in Washington. Jeffrey, you first. Is Hillary toast?
No, not at all. Bernie has to win states that don't border on his own state of Vermont, and that's not going to be quite as easy. Hillary's always figured that there was a firewall in South Carolina because of the Clintons' relationship with the black community and getting the black vote in South Carolina. It's not sure that Bernie can do that. He's meeting this week with Reverend Al Sharpton to try and bolster his position with the black community, but this is a crapshoot. It's anybody's game. Also, don't forget that Hillary has a huge lead with what's called superdelegates. Iowa and New Hampshire only produce 4% of the delegates, and with the superdelegates factored in, Hillary is still way ahead and still the favorite to get the nomination.
Armstrong, let's bring you in from Washington. What should some of the minor Republican candidates, like, say, Ben Carson, do now?
For full disclosure, I remain Dr. Carson's business manager and close advisor. Dr. Carson has no intentions of dropping out the race. He never expected to do well in New Hampshire. He spent no time there. His focus is now on South Carolina, where he will be until February 21st when he flies to New York for a speech. He believes that he can do well in South Carolina. The voters certainly fits his profile, evangelical. It's a very conservative state, and so Dr. Carson will spend his resources there. I think Chris Christie has indicated that he's headed back to New Jersey. He's got to reevaluate and start thinking about whether he's going to drop out the race. Bush's team has also indicated that for the first time, he's thinking about whether it's viable or not about whether it's viable for him moving forward. And so right now you have really a four-man race. You have Trump, you have Cruz, you have Rubio, and you have still Carson hanging around at fourth. And I think this will be reflected in the debate that's coming up in South Carolina pretty soon. I think it's a state that's wide open. I think this cycle has shown us that anything is possible.
Well, let's bring in Stacy Hilliard, who's our special guest, a Republican commentator, but I know you'll talk right across the political spectrum to us, Stacy. What do you think the Republican voter should do now? Who should they support?
I think the Republican voters really need to start looking at the general election. Who is actually going to be electable come November? Whether it's Sanders or Hillary on the Democrat side, we need to put somebody as our nominee that is actually going to be able to defeat her.
And who would you think is best able to do that?
I'd always said Rubio. I thought he's the candidate for the time. I think he's somebody that can bring people together. But, you know, this is anybody's game. We still have a long time to go. We're heading into South Carolina and into Super Tuesday, where we're going to have it wide open that anybody can come in. Kasich proved that in New Hampshire. And we'll see what happens. I think Kasich will play well. Cruz is definitely going to play well in the South. And it's really too close to call right now.
So even Super Tuesday, which often sets the direction of travel, if not sets the whole thing off, often for both parties, could not really be decisive this time around.
It may not be. I mean, traditionally, people have dropped out after New Hampshire because of lack of funds, not lack of will. And I think that we'll see moving into South Carolina, people are going to stay in longer than they normally would because Trump has added a different dynamic to the field. And I think if the Republicans are smart, those mainstream and kind of what have been dubbed establishment Republicans, they would start to really push behind one candidate who's going to be elected. You have to remember, Trump's never polled over 35%, which means the majority of Republicans are supporting a more moderate, a more mainstream, or more establishment candidate. So I think that you'll see after Super Tuesday people starting to drop out. But then you have the dynamic of potentially Bloomberg coming in. And he's been saying that he's going to see what happens at the end of March.
I think we should talk about it in a minute. But let me just pitch it back to Jeffrey and Armstrong here. Let me get you to talk about the other side, if I may. Jeffrey, if you were a Republican strategist, what would you be thinking right now?
Well, I was on Monday, I was in Miami speaking to a major Jeb Bush backer and strategist. I mean, I'm talking about a really major guy who's been with the Bush family for many, many years, going all the way back to George Sr. And he tells me that Jeb is a strategy. The strategy now is to amass as many delegates as possible between he and Kasich and Christie. And they're going to try and keep Christie in the race to nullify Rubio, to get as many delegates as possible to deny Donald Trump the automatic crowning of the nomination at the convention in July. In other words, Jeb Bush is now playing for a brokered convention. And they are also planning at the moment to hijack that convention so that Bush will secure the nomination and bring Kasich along on the ticket as vice president. Now, that's a very dangerous game to play because it puts all of the chips on one roll of the dice. If he can pull it off and get the nomination, that's one thing. If not, and Bloomberg comes in, it's a whole different game. But even if Jeb Bush manages to hijack the convention and secure the nomination, if Donald Trump goes to Cleveland in July with the largest selection of delegates, he's not going to be pleased, and he will form a third party and completely sink the Republicans.
Well, Armstrong, that would be, as Jeffrey suggests, an extraordinary strategy, wouldn't it? Because the sort of anti-establishment, anti-existing politics candidate is going to get trumped, quite literally, by the establishment, the regular guys ganging up on him at the convention.
You know, this is really complicated. We don't have much precedence for this, and there's a lot of guessing of what you think could possibly happen. Donald Trump is such a wild card. Even if you sit down and negotiate with him and you come to some understanding going forward, I don't know if the deal holds up or not. You have Jeb Bush in New Hampshire calling him a liar. And that's just a whole different ball game. They really just despise him. They just have total disdain for them. I don't know if they can galvanize around someone like a Trump. I just don't know. And then many of them don't believe that he's a true conservative, that he really holds the values of the Republican Party. Whether a candidate can rise to Trump, I don't know if that's possible. I think the best strategy, if the Republicans really have any shot at winning the White House, is to rally around the candidate that is gaining the steam and the momentum that the American people, especially the Republican base, shows a lot of faith in, and try to arm Mr. Trump with the kind of polish and the kind of temperament that is necessary to be the kind of candidate that could defeat a Hillary Clinton if she's the nominee.
And I was going to ask you, Armstrong, to chip in about the Democrats as well. If you were, say, a Hillary strategist, what would you be thinking right now?
Well, you know, she really doesn't have much to concern herself with because Bernie Sanders, as Jeffrey said, would do well in a place like New Hampshire. Outside of New Hampshire, Mrs. Clinton still dominates across the board. She will do well. I think Bernie Sanders is a very decent guy. He's bringing a level of conversation to the dialogue about Wall Street and about millennials who are not represented in this process. But other than that, it will be, I don't see a scenario where it's remotely possible for Bernie Sanders to defeat her. And I think she knows this very well. And I think now that New Hampshire is behind her, she should march pretty smoothly the rest of the way.
Stacey, let's bring you back in here. The nature of this year's fight is extraordinarily vicious. I mean, it's always a little bit alien to our UK sentiments, where politics isn't quite so personal, even at its worst. But this time around, how can a candidate really emerge with any credibility when so much has been said about them and their peers over these last few months?
Well, I think we saw this in New Hampshire, which is why Kasich did so well and why Bernie did so well. They rose above the politics, above the name-calling, and above the mudslinging, and they have been running a very positive campaign. And when you speak to voters in New Hampshire, that was something that really appealed to them. But I just want to comment on this issue about Hillary having nothing to worry about. I think Hillary has a lot to worry about. She's been in this position before. She's been the favorite, and she lost to someone who was an idealist and who was seen as a outsider. And that's who our president is now. And she lost to him. So I think she has a lot to worry about. The polling numbers, people don't trust her. People don't believe that she's believable, that she cares about them, that she's going to do things in their interest. They believe she's only doing things in her interest, which is why you have this swell of support behind Bernie. And he's flooding into South Carolina with workers, staffers, volunteers. I think you're going to be surprised. We shouldn't underestimate him. And on the Republican side, the best debate we had was the one without Trump, where the candidates were actually able to talk about policy and not have to deflect insults.
And can I just pick you up on something you mentioned, the Bloomberg factor, which is another delicious unknown in all this. And yet I'm told he may be well known to us here in the UK, he may be well known to the eastern seaboard of the States, but has he really got much clout in California, in Nevada, or, you know, in the north?
He is well known. He's known across the country. People are really wanting him to come in. I think he will struggle in some really strong red states for some of his policies that he's put in New York. He'll be seen as a bit of a liberal. But if it's Trump, Sanders, I think Bloomberg stands a very good chance, and it's a no-brainer for him to get in. If it's Sanders and another Republican, I think he will probably not come in.
Jeffrey, would you put some money on Michael Bloomberg as an outside shot?
Yes. Yeah, I think the only thing that keeps him out is the nomination of Hillary. I think if it's Sanders, he comes in no matter who the Republicans put up. But an interesting statistic does get thrown up after New Hampshire. No Republican candidate who has achieved the nomination has ever done so without winning Iowa or New Hampshire. And South Carolina has, in the last, I forget how many cycles, but many, always picked the winner. So if Trump, and he's way ahead in South Carolina, equally ahead in South Carolina as he was in New Hampshire. If Trump wins South Carolina, then the odds makers have to say, look, he's following in the tradition of all of the other Republican nominees for the presidency and could win it.
Armstrong, Michael Bloomberg's sort of half Republican, isn't he? Could you support him?
Well, you know, as someone who's a broadcaster, I don't state my opinion on those kind of issues, even though I do support my friend, Dr. Ben Carson. But generally, I don't want to get into that. I have a lot of respect for Mr. Bloomberg. I've interviewed him, and I think he would add an interesting dynamic. You know, I have to tell you this. I hear what our guest is saying about Mrs. Clinton, and I hope she's challenged, and I hope she's correct. But I don't think that the map of the voters to play out in Bernie Sanders' favor. And more than that, I think it's going to be very difficult for the establishment or anybody to stop Mr. Trump. He's way ahead in my native home state of South Carolina. He will do well in places like Nevada. He will do very well in places like the South. They lack that red meat. They like that meat about keep the Muslims out. Even his vulgar language that people call vulgar, people in the South would not see it as vulgar. That's the way they communicate with each other. They take him as being serious, as being tough. And I think we've seen the worst that he probably can give us as a candidate. And if he ever gets on his best behavior, which he's showing signs of it, especially after you look at Iowa, the way he eventually congratulated and conceded to Ted Cruz, but he changed that within hours. If he's able to get his temperament under control, to really say something for a change where people really know what he believes, because I don't think anyone really knows what Trump believes and how he will govern, I think it's going to be very difficult to stop the steamrolling that you may see going forward.
And Stacy, just a final thought to you on the man you said was your favourite. You used the past tense, Marco Rubio, the photogenic guy, clearly a lead for many. What went wrong there? Can he ever come back?
I think he can. He has to readjust, reassess some things. I think he jumped a little too early on thinking it was a general election campaign in New Hampshire in the debate. And I think if he and the other candidates are actually able to hold Trump to account to say, how are you going to do this? How are you going to stop ISIS? How are you going to create jobs? Give us a plan. Kind of do the kamikaze type debate that Christie did with Rubio in New Hampshire. I think he can still stand a chance. Because I was just home at Christmas in my home state of Texas and where my family is in Memphis, and I haven't found a Trump supporter. I found people who say, you know, sometimes he does make a little bit of sense, but I could never support him. And they're supporting Cruz, Rubio, and Kasich.
Stacy Hilliard, good to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
A reminder, you can catch up with Sky News Debate on Apple TV, Roku, and Catch Up, and of course on skynews.com/US. The Syrian conflict is becoming even more complex. The exodus is worsening. Since the fighting started 5 years ago, more than half of the people there have been forced to leave their homes. Last month, the United Nations said that 13.5 million people out of a pre-conflict population of 23 million have been displaced. Well, let's cross now to Gaziantep in Turkey, close to the Syrian border. Dalia Al-Awqati is the Director of Programmes in North Syria for Mercy Corps, the largest aid organisation working in Syria after the United Nations. And Dalia, I imagine conditions are pretty tough. Just describe what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. Well, the conditions right now are definitely difficult for Mercy Corps staff and partners on the ground. Mercy Corps is the second largest provider of humanitarian assistance in North Syria, serving an estimated 500,000 people a month. So a lot of people depend on us to get assistance in, of course, and to make sure that they are able to meet their basic needs. The situation over the past several days now is continuously deteriorating. A lot of people have had to leave their homes in search of safety, with actually quite a large population still in Aleppo city now, waiting to see what the fate of their city is.
Tell me about the logistics. How are you able to move supplies around the country or get supplies into the country, given the fact that most of Syria is a war zone?
Well, it's actually, it's a great question and a very difficult process. It's a very time-consuming process, of course. We're able to transport supplies into North Syria across two routes. One route goes through northern Syria, through Aleppo Governorate, and it's that same route that's now been cut into Aleppo city. So that was our easiest, most direct route into Aleppo city, and we use it to provide assistance in northern rural Aleppo, and then again partially in the city. And then on the other side, we are able to go through a relatively western route through Idlib Governorate, and that route is still usable, of course, for Aleppo city, but it's a very risky road, a road with a lower capacity, and it's been very unreliable in the past. It hosts quite a few skirmishes, really. So every day or two over the past few months, it's actually been where we haven't been able to transport goods because it's been under sniper fire, it's been under attack by different armed factions. So a very risky route, a route that comes at a very heavy cost to our staff, of course, and our team.
Well, let's just bring in Jeffrey Robinson in New York and Armstrong Williams in Washington. Armstrong, it strikes me, this is pretty humbling. Governments around the world have failed to find any kind of solution or humanitarian solution for this particular crisis. It's been going for 5 years, and yet these people are committed to risking their lives to trying to feed their fellow men.
You know, Martin, you really have to in sort of a contemplative way, consider both sides. I mean, I think Sweden is an example of a government that was once rich in resources, who tried to do the benevolent and the compassionate thing because they felt deeply for these people that they needed a place of refuge. And yet they started out with a small number of refugees to bring in, and then they increased those numbers, and all of a sudden 35,000 was dropped on the country, and they could not handle it. Economically, they could not handle it. They don't have corporations to pay for it. It's bankrupt in the country. They can't take in any more. And if you take a place like Sweden, Sweden is sort of an example of what other countries are facing, you know. And then you give the false hope to these refugees that they can leave their homeland and they can find a better way of life. You got babies, you got the elderly, you got the indigent, and you mix all these people together. And yet you get sometimes when you get these refugees in places like a place like Germany, their values clash, there are rapes, there's harassment, there's crime, and you mix all these things together. It shows you that this process was not well thought through. And not only has the government become victim in trying to help, the refugees that you're trying to rescue are even more victims than they were before. And until someone gets a handle around this situation and consider the consequences and whether you want to build sanctuary cities in these areas where these people are to try to take care of them so you can use the resources wisely, not much is going to change. It's only going to worsen.
Jeffrey, the West in particular and the Americans specifically do have a responsibility here, don't they? Because I think it's widely accepted they were sort of interfering in the conflict by trying to support some Syrian opposition 5 years ago when this all started. And yet it's descended into a complete mess. Isn't there not a legacy responsibility there?
We all have a responsibility. I mean, the sheer callousness that we are demonstrating in the West towards a humanitarian problem of enormous tragedy. I mean, 13.5 million people thrown out of their own country. And as Armstrong said, the indigent grandparents, children, parents. I mean, it is just horrifying how we in the West and all over the West say, oh yeah, we want to help and give lip service, but not in my backyard. I just don't know that there is an answer. I think, though, there is another problem which is going to make this even worse. And I want to get into this very simply to say oil. The price of oil has been coming down. We're at, what, $20 a barrel, something like that. Predictions are that it could go as low as 10. Now, that will bankrupt ISIL because they won't be able to earn the kind of money that they were earning at $40 and $50 and $60 a barrel. But it's also going to bankrupt Russia. And that presents a huge problem to Mr. Putin. And what leaders traditionally do when they are in trouble economically at home is turn to foreign policy and look for some sort of a major headline in foreign policy. He will do that in Syria. We need to get rid of Assad. He wants to keep Assad. And as long as he's there looking for headlines to save his ass at home, the situation is going to get much, much, much worse. And it is just tragic.
And Dalia, that's a terrible prospect, isn't it? That these global forces of countries and allegiances around the globe are fighting one another and are disagreeing one another, and you're dealing with the real consequences of everyday survival.
Well, essentially, that's absolutely the reality. The biggest toll of the Syrian conflict has been on civilians. And while Mercy Corps and other actors provide humanitarian assistance, it does not replace the need for a political solution. A political solution really is the only end to the suffering of Syrians.
How do you operate and who do you decide to help? Because you don't know who your friend is or who your enemy is at this stage, do you?
No, well, we're a humanitarian agency, so we started operating in Syria well over 3 years ago, almost 4 years now. And so at the very beginning of the crisis, we're able to get in and actually start supporting communities and people that were in need of assistance, people that no longer had access to subsidized resources, people that no longer had access to basic food items and other basic items. So we were the first actor on the field. Mercy Corps really was the first to show up in Syria and say, we're here to help. And that's really gained us a lot of credibility, and it's maintained our strong reputation both inside Syria and outside, especially with the families and the communities that we work with, which are essentially the most integral part of our work. We don't pick who we work with outside of people in need. So we deal with people who are in need. We work with those people to provide assistance that they now depend on for meeting their basic needs, their day-to-day needs. And Working based on a principle of humanitarian neutrality, a very core concept to our work, is really what enables us to be the largest operator in North Syria.
And what about your funding? Because presumably what you do costs money.
Oh, absolutely. We have different funding streams than we have over the past few years, but we get a lot of money from, well, quite a bit of money from different donors. And particularly for North Syria, we are funded by the US donors and also by UK donors.
Dalia, thank you very much indeed. Jeffrey, Armstrong, good to see you again. Thank you. And thank you for watching. That's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, Roku and Catch Up. And of course at skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.